Hello and welcome to the Mindful Men podcast, a show inspiring men to be mindful about their lives. Each week, we'll dive into a range of topics that matter to men and hear from everyday people doing extraordinary things. So if you love the show, please give it a 5-star rating and share it with your mates. Now, before we get into this week's episode, please note that some of the content may trigger you. And if this happens, please reach out to your support networks. It's really important. If you can't get enough of Mindful Men, head over to our website. It's www.mindful-men.com.au. Find the show notes and the links to our socials there. But for now, sit back, relax, and let's get mindful. G'day guys, and welcome to another episode of the Mindful Men podcast. I'm your host, Simon Rinnie. And today we're getting mindful about veterans and the support available to those serving, retirees, and their families via Open Arms. And joining me for today's discussion, I've got Ken Otter from Sunshine Coast. How are you going, Ken?
I'm going well, thanks, Simon. We're in similar parts of the world.
We are. It's nice to talk to someone local. I usually have these discussions with people all over the world, so it's good to have some sunny coasters represented.
Or we might take the opportunity to acknowledge we're on Cubby Cubby and Jindaburra land, both of us, I think.
Absolutely, the Gubby Gubby people here, and I guess paying our respects to the elders past, present and emerging as well. Just to introduce you, you're an accredited mental health social worker with over 40 years experience. For the past 10 years, you've been working as a counsellor to veterans and their families with Open Arms. But before we get into Open Arms, I'd like to hear a bit more about you and where you're from. So we're coming to each other from the sunny coast today. Yeah, are you from the sunny coast or where did you grow up? And I guess tell us a bit about your experience as a social worker.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I grew up around Brisbane, in what was a little country town called Kalanga, just north of Brisbane, way back. It's not a country town anymore. It's an outer suburb. But I've worked in a number of capacities around the state and in other states, done some time in the Territory and New South Wales. And, I came to social work in my late 20s, I suppose. I'd done a few different things, dug a few ditches, tended a few bars, got into sales at one stage, and then I gradually got a social work degree. Bit easier in those days because you didn't have to pay, didn't end up with a debt, which I think was a good thing. Initially, I spent a few decades in child and family welfare, statutory child and family welfare. So in a variety of roles, child protection, youth justice, community grants, funding, policy. And I worked for myself for about 10 years, recruiting and supporting specialist family-based carers for young people. Yeah, about 10 years ago, I came to Open Arms as a counsellor.
Wow. What was the draw towards social work? Like, did you have something in mind when you went into study and picked that degree, or was it something that someone pointed out to you and said, hey, why don't you give this a go?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been trying to think about that since you asked me, and I think there are a couple of streams. One was that when I was thinking, what am I going to do with the rest of my working life, the things I'd been doing, whilst they were interesting, didn't carry the same sort of meaning. I had grown up in that country town. There was a residential for kids in care that had been there for many years, and I had a lot to do with the kids who were placed there. And as a kid growing up, I was quite familiar with that, and I knew the people who ran it and all that. So I guess that was in the back of my mind as well. So, I suppose, and we'll talk a bit more about meaning as we're talking about veterans because it's a key issue. But I suppose I thought, something that's got a bit more meat to it, a bit more meaning, and you can sometimes do some good things. So that's what drew me, I guess, into social work.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was picking my social work degree, I was certainly looking for that flexibility in different roles. If I ever got bored of the mental health space, I could go do something like child protection or working with veterans or whatever it is. I can move around a bit with a social work degree.
Yeah, it's pretty portable and it's gives you a great grounding in community development, and you can really pick what you want to do. Some people choose radical social work and march around with flags and down streets, and others look at organisational roles, policies. So it's a pretty broad-based degree, and I've found that it's worked well for me because I've even though I worked for a number of decades in child and family welfare, I had a lot of different roles there. So it never became boring.
Yeah, and you mentioned before that you did a bit of time working in the Northern Territory. I'd love to hear a bit about that experience and what that kind of did to your personal development, but also your professional development too.
Yeah, it wasn't that long ago. And I guess the experience I'd had was why I ended up over there, because a few of us were asked to go over and do some policy and program work after one of the child protection reports over there. So we were reframing policies, programs and responses to issues in the Territory, particularly as it related to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I found the Territory, I'd worked in North Queensland, far North Queensland, in Cairns for a little while. But I found the Territory was another step up in terms of cultural difference, and really enjoyed my time there.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of I guess, a lot of heavy media attention on stuff that's happening in the Alice Springs at the moment, and particularly around youth and being out on the streets and things like family and domestic violence. Was that some of the stuff that you come across in the Territory? And is it any different in the Territory compared to, say, somewhere like Queensland, which you've also spent a bit of time in as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's there are many communities around the Territory. There are quite a number of different language groups. There are a number of locations where English is maybe a third language, and a number of Aboriginal people, particularly in central Queensland, live fairly isolated even from Alice Springs, and the cultural differences between the different groups is quite strong. And one of the things we were encouraging was the employment of Aboriginal people so that they could give a bit of good advice on what to do and what not to do. I was talking to someone this morning actually about I think it's a Netflix 4 episodes, which is on based in Alice Springs. It's about a young Aboriginal policewoman. It's called True Colours. That's on at the moment. I'd recommend, if people want to have a look at something which was pretty authentic in terms of the cultural differences and the things that are relevant in that part of the country, I think that's a really good look.
Yeah, wonderful. We'll find the link and we'll put that in the show notes so that people can check it out for themselves as well. Really good resource to check out. I'm going to watch it later on today, actually. It's going to be a good viewing for my Friday afternoon. But Ken, let's talk about Open Arms, and I'm really keen to hear more about veterans. The episodes that we do have where we have veterans on and sharing their experiences are very well received. So for anyone who hasn't heard of Open Arms, and I guess this is an Australian-only organisation, please let us know if that's not the case. But what is it? How can it help veterans? And also, how can it help their families too?
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Yeah, it is a national program. It's federal government department, basically, or a sub-department of the broader Department of Veterans Affairs. We operate quite separately because we're a counselling service. For veterans who may see this, it's relevant that the way we do our work is different to the claims and compensation process that's done by DVA. We used to be called VVCS, and it was formed originally through impetus of Vietnam veterans. But now it's a service for all veterans in the broadest sense, in that anyone who's been in the military for longer than a day is eligible for our counselling services and eligible for a white card for mental health treatment. In fact, anyone who comes out of the military nowadays walks out the gate with a white card for mental health, which is really great. And it's available for partners and ex-partners up to 5 years, and children, including adult children. And so we do counselling all around Australia, individual counselling, couples counselling, family counselling. We're not a specialised service for some of those diagnosed conditions of young kids like ADHD and so forth, but we do generalised family counselling. The way it's framed is we've got a number of centres around Australia, in major centres. In Queensland, we've got, Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast and Townsville. And apart from that, we engage outreach program providers, psychologists and mental health accredited social workers in private practice. So we cover pretty well everywhere in terms of availability. We've got a 24-hour assistance line, which I think I may have sent you and might be able to put up. And that's where people do their intake, but they can call if they're in distress. And the other things we do is we run some groups on a variety of things, anger management, transition from the military, and a range of others. And we have a community engagement program where we engage with other service providers like RSLs and some of those newer service providers like Mates for Mates, Soldier On, and there are quite a number of those organisations out there now. And we have a peer program with lived experience veterans and family members of veterans. They can engage with veterans, speak the language that they speak. And that's a really good program.
Yeah, lived experience is I think personally, as a lived experience therapist myself, like it's such a powerful thing to have someone on both sides of the therapy journey, both the practitioner and the client, who just kind of understand that same language and the same feelings, the same thoughts. They're never going to be the same because we all experience mental ill health or illness or however you want to phrase it differently. But it's so much easier when you say, I'm feeling depressed, and for that other person to know, yeah, I know what that feels like.
Yeah, and a key issue for veterans is the transition. The training reshapes your brain, basically, and the life in the military is different to almost any other career you can mention. It's a higher order purpose. There's a lot of meaning associated with it. And when you're in the military, it's procedurally driven. And so when one leaves the military, sometimes people feel as though they've landed on an alien planet with a whole lot of aliens in it, and particularly if they've been in for a while. And so that transition period is difficult, and that's borne out by the difficult fact that the suicide rate amongst veterans is higher than the general population in the couple of years after they leave. It's actually a touch lower or about the same when they're in the military, but it's quite a vulnerable time for veterans when they leave, because sometimes people leave the military not of their own choice. It may be a medical discharge. And so, the life's dream of being in the military is shattered sometimes at initial training.
Yeah. I can imagine, like, for guys, it's really hard to open up in the first place. And when we're talking about veterans, we're talking about not just guys, but, women as well. But guys specifically, and I guess given this is the Mindful Men podcast, they really do struggle to come in the door and do therapy as a way of coping or improving or even just maintenance and being well and living well. I can imagine coming into a therapy clinic in the military, like with what happens with Open Arms, can be very challenging. So what does therapy look like in Open Arms? Is it in a clinic? Is it, you mentioned outreach? Is it in people's homes? Is it over the phone? How do you guys break down some of those barriers for veterans coming into therapy so that they don't feel like an overwhelming experience?
It's mixed. It's with our centres and with the outreach providers, it's generally centre-based, talking therapy. With the peer programs, it's an outreach program, so the peers will meet with veterans or their families outside of the office. It can be as different as you can imagine, because the counselling that's provided can be about, it mightn't be anything to do with military. It might be about childhood trauma. It might be, so we're not restricted as to what sort of things we deal with. I think it's fair to say that younger veterans, both men and women, are more in tune with asking for help and in tune with their own mental health than older veterans. I've dealt with veterans from World War II on. Now we've got veterans who've been for Iraq, Afghanistan. Some, the majority of veterans have not been deployed at all. They've spent their time in Australia. But they may do disaster relief. Some of that's challenging, peacekeeping, border patrol, all those sorts of things come into our area. And quite often we're dealing with people who left the military some time ago, because with trauma, and we talk a little bit about that, it may not crop up initially, and it may crop up when someone's under stress later, or even as part of the ageing process. Vietnam veterans now are, in their 70s, and sometimes they've managed to keep a lid on their trauma until age sets in and your locks come off the box. So, the type of approach really depends on what issues someone brings. But, we're finding with the peer program, it's a good connection to talk with veterans about what it's like, because it's a bit scary if you haven't been involved with counselling before, and particularly related to trauma. Even though trauma therapy is therapeutic, you're still revisiting stuff that you don't particularly want to visit. And the more formal exposure therapies and so forth require you to do that, to revisit and reshape your memory of events. Yeah, so it's really different depending, and couples therapy can be about managing what is a difficulty for people in the military, and that is that they'll be posted to different places every couple of years. It's hard on families, hard on partners, hard on kids, particularly if someone transitions and they do have no diagnosed condition like depression or anxiety or PTSD, then it can be tricky on relationships.
Yeah, I was going to ask how it presents with families and the moving. And so what's some of those common themes with families that have to move around, and both, the veterans and the extended families as well, the partner and the children? Like, what's some of the things? Is it disconnection from community? Is it the lack of supports? Like, what are they talking about and worrying about?
With the moving, it's like anyone who's mobile, I guess, and I've experienced it myself, that you'll be in a place for a few months or a year or whatever, and you do make friends or try to, but then you leave. And so it's a different experience to someone who's lived in the same place all their life. And so the tendency is not to get too close to people because you're going to move. That's one thing. Of course, with veterans who have been in combat and so forth, it's taken to another level where they may have actually lost colleagues. And if there have been veterans who have died through combat, that's felt by every single member. They feel really close to that. So in terms of the connection, and I suppose the difference too is way back, families tended to live on bases, and they tend not to now. They live in the community more. Some live on base. So that tight veteran family community is a bit more dispersed nowadays.
Yeah, I remember those hubs, because I grew up in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. So you've got Edinburgh Air Base, nearby, and I remember I spent some time in Canberra as well. And you've got the family units and housing situations just near Duntroon, and it used to be quite close knit. And I guess once you move out to the community, while you might have access to the broader community, that support is very disjointed as well, I can imagine.
Yeah, it is. It is. There are services around. There's a Defence Community Organisation, which is a government department too, that connects up with families and so forth, particularly if there's issues related to moving and relocation. But yes, it's a challenge. And sometimes you'll have the veteran might move and be posted somewhere and the family remains back where they can get extended family and friend support. So you get that disconnection happening there too.
Yeah. And how does that present in, I guess, relationships and keeping families together? I can imagine just by, thinking about it and what you've briefly described there is that maybe relationships might be at a strain and break down a bit more frequently than others.
Yeah, it does put a strain on, particularly when someone's in the military, whether they're male, female, the military takes priority. So if they say go here and go here now, that's what happens. So there's no debate over it. There is a bit more flexibility now that perhaps there used to be, trying to respond to people's individual needs, but the overall priorities of the military need to be met. So some people leave the military because of the tension between the job and family, particularly as kids are growing up. Dads or mums can miss important milestones of their kids, and then connecting with their kids, in a way which is not full time. So there's a range of challenges that apply in the military that don't necessarily apply in other jobs. And with deployments too, with the more recent conflicts, they tended to be shorter but more frequent.
Yeah.
And research is showing that the more frequent the deployments, the more issues crop up as well.
Why is that? Why would the frequency impact the impact on our health and well-being for a veteran?
I think similar to first responders generally, particularly police, living under constant potential threat is tiring, emotionally tiring. The threat chemicals are sort of flowing around your body all the time, and you're never really at ease. So part of the approaches, mindful approaches that we use, will be about encouraging getting a balance back once you don't need the adrenaline and the cortisol to keep you on your toes, how you engage in more mindful activities which are safe, pleasant, and give you those nice wellbeing chemicals. And as you'd know, Simon, mindfulness is very individual too. One person's mindfulness is another person's irritation. You've only got to talk about golf for that one.
I was going to ask you how the veterans and serving members approach when you say, let's try some mindfulness. It's not something that jumps out to me. When I first heard of it, I got my back up. I'm like, I'm not doing this hippie mindfulness thing. I love it now. And that's why, hence the Mindful Men podcast and Mindful Men the therapy business that I run. Yeah, how do they approach mindfulness when you pitch it as an idea?
Well, it depends on the person, because with some people, they have trouble getting in touch with their body and their feelings. You've been trained to be unemotional, so that's a tricky one. But generally, the way in for me is just to say, what do you really enjoy doing? What's the activity you do or used to do where you're not worried about things, where you feel good? And there are some classics, like some people like to ride motorbikes, which can be either mindful or risky. Surfing's a great one, that it's, some of the ultimate mindfulness, because anyone who surfs knows that when you pick up a wave, you're not thinking about anything else in the world. And for some people, it might be running, it might be just walking in the bush, walking your dog, anything that connects you to your senses, I guess. Sometimes I avoid calling it mindfulness for a while.
I do too. Actually, it depends on the client that I'm working with. The language that we use is really important, actually, in terms of how they receive it. Even just saying I'm a therapist sometimes, the guys that I work with don't want to hear that. They want to, maybe I'm just a mentor or a coach or just another bloke, we can strip it right back. And that can just in itself can really be helpful. And you mentioned earlier that these days now when someone leaves the military, they're given the mental health, is it the white card you mentioned? How long has that been in place, and why is that so important? Because, what was happening decades earlier when they weren't getting that white card?
Well, some were and some weren't, but now everyone does, and it's automatic, and it doesn't have to be about military-related issues. Now, that's separate from the claims or compensation process, where there needs to be a connection to your service. But I think it's been in now for a few years. I could get it wrong, maybe 3, maybe 4. But it's really been given a push in the last 2 or 3 years, where people are given the card before they leave. And it's difficult because quite often in the transition seminars and all that sort of thing that military people go through, they're not listening to too much at that point, because they're either cranky that they're leaving or can't wait to get out the door, So it's the timing is difficult. And sometimes I'll meet people and they don't know who we are, even though they will have heard it in the transition seminars and by other connections. But yeah, it's a great thing, and that provides counselling. It also provides support for medication, private hospital admission if needed, that sort of thing. Yeah, and the mental health issues can be wide-ranging. They can be anxiety, depression, they can be trauma. So, yeah, it's a good service.
I can imagine that kind of support would also help with that transition process and trying to perhaps rediscover identity or even a purpose, sense of purpose, maybe what jobs to go for next, how to find purpose outside of the military. Would that be the case? And how might you support someone to find a new passion or a new purpose outside of the military?
Again, it's very individual, but I guess it's first things first. If someone's in a lot of distress, the first part of the process is to assist them to lower the distress and emotionally regulate. But we use some solution-focused approaches to look at future once people are ready to look at that. There are a number of organisations that assist veterans to gain employment. There's a national strategy for veteran employment. Retraining opportunities. There's now a tendency towards recognition of prior learning if people are doing retraining, because there's a lot of training occurs in the military which doesn't necessarily translate really easily to the outside. Language is different, all that sort of thing. So there's more work being done on recognising the learning that you've had in the military, and that can assist with diplomas or certificate courses or even degrees. And military people, they're very well trained in a range of things. And one of the disappointments that happens is, you might be in charge of millions of dollars worth of equipment, up to 100 or 200 people you might be responsible for them. And so your skill level is at the level of a CEO of a medium-sized company, and then you come out and people say, don't know. And people can be a bit nervous of veterans, because they've worked in a command and control structure, and so that's a bit different to the way civilian organisations work. So learning how to reframe the way you present yourself in employment outside is important.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I remember this might be about a decade ago. There was a heavy push on the TV for military careers and on all the different armed forces. I remember these ones vividly, the ones where it was almost like a party atmosphere. One day you're jumping off a boat into this tropical water. The next day you're doing something really hands-on. And they really painted it, from my recollection, as something where you can go in, learn all these amazing skills, and then that will serve you for a lifetime. But what you're saying is a bit of a disconnect there and real struggle to transition out. And you picked up on something there as well as around, I guess, stigma associated with employing a veteran in a position as well. How frequently does that come up for the people that you work with?
It comes up a lot because out in the community there are a range of different views about the military. Some there are about police. Some people love police, some people hate them. And it depends on your family experience, all that sort of thing. But the bottom line is the military's there for a purpose. And people don't always agree with the purpose that the military is used for. And so everyone's got an opinion. So that can affect a veteran's interactions with people generally in the community. The other thing that happens too is that because you're in the military and you've got this higher order purpose, whatever that may be, it's very hard to come back and stand around a barbecue on a Sunday afternoon and talk about what colour your Commodore is, So it takes a while to reintegrate with casual social conversation. And so sometimes veterans will withdraw, not just because of trauma, but because of the disconnect with those people they may have been friends with before. They've changed fundamentally and they come back and they say, oh, my friends are still the same as they were. I've changed somewhat fundamentally. So learning new social skills and so forth is really important. But the research is pretty clear that we're not meant to be lighthouse keepers, most of us, and social connection is very good for mental health. But sometimes it's a difficult road to reconnect with others because they're talking a different language almost.
Yeah. What's some of the coping strategies, both healthy but also unhealthy, that you're seeing some of the veterans use? Are they resorting to drinking? Is it drugs? Is it other destructive behaviours, or do they go the opposite way and it's full-on exercise freaks and all that type of stuff? How are they coping?
Well, a bit of all that. As you know, Simon, that if we're under stress, two things happen. One's we might get overwhelmed by it, which case we withdraw, or we might push it away. And we push it away in a variety of ways. Could be gambling, drinks, drugs, could be sexual addiction, could be gaming, could be going to the gym 15 times a week, pumping as much iron as you can, which is stress producing. Exercise is great, but over-exercise turns it around a bit. Yeah, I think everyone copes differently. Some people withdraw, and that's in some ways even the most damaging because, I find some people will lock themselves in their house, particularly if they've been on deployment. They'll come back and just can't cope with being out. And if they've had trauma whilst they've been on deployment, then there's threat everywhere. And so can't walk into a shopping centre, don't like crowds. Some veterans get through that using service dogs, very, very big part of the system now, and they're able to, manage their moods a bit by having a dog with them that's responding to their mood. And a lot of veterans will, really respond to that sort of thing. Some of the methods we use are what we call in vivo exposure, where we gradually expose people to situations that are stressful for them. But instead of experiencing the stress and then leaving, which reinforces it, it's a matter of sitting through it until your anxiety reduces and gradually doing that over and over until you can bring the general level of anxiety down. And so we do, some work on that sort of thing. So you're just directly attacking the anxiety.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you've worked with vets from World War II. Obviously, I guess I would assume up to modern day conflicts as well, or situations. And I'm thinking in my mind as you're telling these stories is around how generations of men look at mental health differently. And you also mentioned at the start that younger generations are a bit more open to talking about mental health. Does it matter which conflict they went to or what situation they were? Like, is a World War II vet vastly different from an Afghanistan vet or, Vietnam as well? There's a lot of stigma associated with that in the community and stuff like that. Does it matter which conflict it was? And how do the different generations deal with mental distress or trauma or anything like that?
It certainly does. affect, there's no better or worse in this business, although a lot of veterans measure themselves against others. And some reluctance is about, well, I don't deserve to have PTSD, or I don't deserve to be here, that sort of thing. So part of it's encouraging people to measure themselves against themselves rather than others. But yeah, certainly all of the World War II in most people's minds regarded as a righteous war and have different opinions about different conflicts. Peacekeepers have their own challenges because the rules of engagement have had them sometimes observing things which they're not allowed to intervene in. So every conflict, and not just the conflict, but the particular postings, because Timor, for example, and other conflicts had different phases. So each of them were very different, and the experiences of veterans were very different. And then disaster, our military were over in Aceh after the tsunami, that sort of thing. They're involved in some of the flood stuff. It's happened in Australia, fires. And so every experience is pretty different. And having a bit of knowledge of that and being able to talk to people about their particular experiences is important. But I guess the big thing is that the older the veteran, the more likely they will be of I suppose, an era where you didn't talk about it, you just sucked it up, and that was it. And that occurred to an extent after Vietnam, and it's gradually changed since then, I think.
Yeah. Do you know if the military, like the different arms of the military, they're trying to combat some of that suck it up mentality? Are they trying to promote mental health as a good thing and talking as a good thing?
Yeah, they are. They are. So there are mental health services available on bases to current serving members. So we provide counselling to current serving members as well as people who have left. Yeah, so the military is struggling with that and struggling with concepts of resilience and so forth. And it changes the way the military approaches training, for example. That's become different over the years as well. But they have regular interactions, the welfare officers on the bases and so forth. And we try to connect with the bases. We have people who go out to the bases and talk to the CEOs and the people who are on the bases. And the bases are all different too, of course. Outside Brisbane, you've got Canungra Barracks, which is a training establishment. So almost everyone at some stage in their military career goes through that base. And then you've got Air Force bases like Amberley outside Brisbane and Tyndall in the Territory, which is outside Katherine. And so, yeah, the different arms of the service are different too, and they're ever-changing as well. Their specialisations are changing.
Yeah. Do you notice a difference when someone from, say, the Army comes in compared to, say, the Navy or the Air Force? Is it a different mindset, or is it all very similar?
No, they're different. They're different. And then within each of them, they've got differences as well, because not everyone in the RAF is a pilot. And not everyone in the Navy goes on boats even. There are some differences. I think just a generalisation, but Navy people tend to be bad sleepers, because when you're on a boat, you're never actually off duty, even if you're off duty, and you can be called up at any point. So sleep is patchy because people are working in 24-hour shifts in effect. So there's some things like that are different. When people join the military is significant too, because some Navy people, for example, join at 17. And as you know, men's brains grow at a slower rate to women. They've now proven that. So you're really not fully developed. Your brain's not fully developed until you're about 25, whereas most people, or a lot of people, join the military when they're about 19. So that's a significant element too.
Trauma comes up. You've mentioned trauma a few times, and I'm often asked, and in the social work, networks that I'm a part of, and the psychology networks, is around trauma-informed care. What is this, and what is trauma, for example? What's complex trauma? So I was hoping you could shed some light based on your experience, and I guess experience within working with military personnel and their families. Like, what is trauma? How does it show up? And I guess what's some of the things to look out for someone who might be experiencing trauma-related, mental illness?
Yeah, you got a few hours. Yeah, trauma comes in many forms. A simple way to explain it, I suppose, if you have a car accident or you're working a counter and someone comes and yells at you, you get a trauma reaction and a memory. It's an unpleasant memory. And generally the symptoms related to that diminish over time. So trauma goes away. It may become an unpleasant memory, but it doesn't disturb you too much. Significant trauma occurs if you have some significant symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, mood changes, and they're intrusive memories, and they'll come unbidden. Complex trauma occurs where you may have had a range of events. You may have childhood trauma coupled with adult trauma, and so you've got a series of events. And the approach for each of them's a bit different. I guess for serious trauma, the memory is different to a normal memory. It's played out through the senses. So normally you experience something, your brain processes it overnight when you go to sleep. Wake up in the morning, someone says, what did you have for breakfast yesterday? You go to the filing cabinet, pull it out, say, I had bacon and eggs. With trauma, it sort of sears its way across your brain like a lightning bolt, and it's not processed in the same way, so it gets misfiled in your brain. So it'll pop up, and it might be triggered by sights, smells, or you mightn't even know what triggers it. And I guess the measure of whether trauma is at the level that it needs addressing would be how much does it interrupt your life? What's it stop you doing? What do you avoid doing? And how does it prevent you leading a fulfilling life? And as we said before, you may get overwhelmed by it, or you may push it away, and you may develop behaviours which are coping behaviours to push it away, which are unhelpful to you.
Yeah. A little while back, I had an episode with Mark Valencia, another Queenslander who was a military vet and left and created this amazing garden. And he uses gardening as a way to manage his mental health. And during that discussion, he mentioned, we were talking a bit about trauma, and he mentioned that trauma can be really significant, as you've described, but also it can be things, particularly in the armed forces or even first responders, that doesn't have to be something quite so violent. It could be just almost repetition of the same type of stuff, high stressful environments as well. What's your thoughts on that? Like, does it have to be so violent, or it can be something that was seemingly innocuous that's resulted in a trauma response?
Yeah, he's right. And you're right that it can be, a workplace can be, people talk about toxic workplaces all the time now, but a workplace can be very difficult if you've got a boss that you feel doesn't treat you right, and they've got power over you or whatever, and on a daily basis you're subjected to something which is uncomfortable for you. It could be conflict between work colleagues. And so, trauma takes many forms, and that's why the approaches probably need to differ. The higher end trauma approaches of exposure therapy, prolonged exposure, or cognitive processing therapy, those sorts of things which go to a particular trauma and are highly effective for that, may not be as effective with some of those other things like bullying and harassment, and those sorts of things can produce trauma reactions.
Yeah, I guess it's important to reflect on that and realise that, because as you mentioned before, in the military, they can often compare their situations with other people, and we do the same out in community as well. We compare my mental health with somebody else's, and am I worthy of support or help as well? And I think in somewhere like the military, where not everyone sees conflict as well, they could still, I guess, develop these trauma kind of, I guess, issues or trauma-related issues and that require help, and it's okay for them to seek help for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, sometimes people will present because they've been told by their spouse or their family that they're angry and difficult to live with. And so the issue of trauma may not crop up at all, or it may not crop up. I've had some people I've seen for a year or two, and then they'll say, well, I've managed the anger now, but I've still got this other stuff. Now we can go for that. So it's all a matter of timing as well. So people may come reluctantly. They may come because their spouse has said, listen, if you don't get help, I'm out of here. So people come with a variety of motivations to counselling, the same as we do when we go to the doctor or the dentist, And so it's a matter of working with where people are at. But yes, encouraging them to consider their journey to be their journey. It's no one else's. It's like grief and loss. You can't tell people how to do grief and loss. You can say, well, you can do it any way you like. It's only damaging if you get stuck at a particular point and you're angry for the rest of your life or depressed for the rest of your life. That's not going to be good for you. But aside from that, there are no real rules about grief and loss. In the same way, there's no real rules for how you deal with trauma or distress. And most of us, I think, in the business like to listen to what people have got to say. It's their journey, not ours. And if they set a priority on this rather than that, we'll go with that priority. But yeah, encouraging people not to compare themselves to others so much, because some work environments, the military is no different. Yeah, in the past, putting your hand up could be a sign of weakness. And there are some downsides to putting your hand up. You might want to be deployed, but if you're diagnosed with something, you may not be deployed. So you try to hide it if you want that promotion or want that deployment or whatever. But the military is getting better at accepting that sometimes mental health issues, they don't have to be permanent. I think that's what we all used to think. You get diagnosed with something or you've got depression or that's it, life's over. But it's not. And this is where you're talking about before, the trauma-informed approaches, is recognising that mental health is a bit of a rocky road for all of us. And there's not too many people if they're being honest, wouldn't put their hand up and say, oh, I've had some tough times, and sometimes are better than others. But clearly, if you can get the help, then, and the military recognise this, they're more likely to send people off to postings while they're taking medication now, as long as they're managing it and all that sort of thing. I think that's the big change, is that there's a recognition that it's not a life sentence if you're experiencing difficulties.
Yeah, and that goes a long way to breaking that stigma of mental health. As you said, like if you're worried that it's going to impact your progression, whether it's in the military or outside in your own other career, you don't want to say anything. So that kind of just adds to that stigma and shame around it. Whereas if someone broke a leg or something like that, once they're healed, they might be going, yep, you're right to go. And so by businesses across Australia and communities recognising that mental health doesn't have to be forever, it's just be for now. We can get through it with the right care and the right support afterwards as well. It's not just a matter of, okay, you're healed now, you're never going to experience it again. It's just an ongoing thing, like servicing your car. The more you service it every year, or if you're like my wife, every other year, the better the car runs. And so if we can look at ourselves like that and accept that mental health is part of our whole body, not just physical health, I think we can go a long way. And I think trauma-informed therapy or care can do this. And I feel this is a bit of a buzzword at the moment. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but everyone's talking about trauma-informed therapy at the moment. So can you give us a bit of light about what that is and how that can help with recovery?
I think you've just been talking about it. I think it's a recognition that the majority of us will experience some form of mental health issues in our life, and probably more than once, and for long or short periods. And so it's like, I guess the difference between defining people, like if someone's got diabetes, we used to call them a diabetic, right? So you're called a diabetic. Well, they're not. They're a person who happens to have diabetes, and they learn to live with it. The fact that they've got to keep themselves alive every day by having insulin is just part of their life. So I guess it's a matter of normalising a whole range of things. And so you're a person first, and then you might happen to also experience anxiety or depression. You may have mood swings, and there are a variety of things you can do about it. Medication may be for you, it may not be for you. Mindfulness, social connections, there's a whole range of things. And so I think the trauma-informed approach is recognising that and creating environments that are safe and responsive. And in my past life, when dealing with young people who maybe had lived in 30 or 40 homes and had to learn the rules of each of them, which I absolutely admire, creating a safe space and creating a place where they could stop and look around and be treated respectfully, that's trauma-informed. And so that's just as important as any counselling or anything like that. So, if we can change the systems around so they're more responsive and accepting, then I think that's the pathway. And even the formal organisations like RSLs have struggled over the years with, first they were run by World War II veterans, then Vietnam veterans were rejected for a period of time, and now they're running the RSLs. And so recognising that institutions and environments are really important to how people feel about themselves.
Yeah. As you're saying that, I was even reflecting on hearing a bit more in the news over more recent years around letting children or family members march in the Anzac Day marches as well. And and maybe just redefining how, like, and making it more community-based as well, as opposed to just veterans. And I think by doing that, we can encompass the whole situation. I think this is great about Open Arms, how it also supports families, not just the serving member or the veteran. It's the families, it's the partner, the children, even the ex-partner. I like that as well, because as we talked about earlier, relationships break down. And by making it more holistic, I think that's a great way to support recovery and to know that it's okay to be not okay. We can get through this. Thinking about recovery, like what some of the successes is there a higher rate of successes on people not, ending their life in suicide if they've been through Open Arms, or do they keep re-engaging? Are they able to sustain, get back into work? Or what's some of the success stories, I guess, from Open Arms and support?
Yeah, well, we do have a range of success stories, people who have successfully dealt with their trauma and their symptoms have either reduced or gone away. Couples who successfully get over the difficulties that they've been experiencing and learn how to communicate together. So every day we'll experience success. The general issue of veteran suicide and so forth is a big one, and that's being addressed in a Royal Commission at the moment. And so it happens on a lot of different levels. But there's no doubt, as I said before, that the immediate couple of years after leaving the military is a critical time. So if we can engage with people during that period, then that's really useful. And again, the peer workers and so forth and other agencies that wrap around veterans in different ways, because as you were saying, you were talking to someone and the gardening is the mindful thing for them. And that's, some agencies, have their gardens and so forth. Others, there's veteran surfing organisations. There's a range of different types of responses. So I think the more of those that people can pick and choose from, because it's all individual, the better. Some people don't want to engage with people from the military when they come out. Some people do. So having diverse responses, I think, is a really good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested. I'm going to pull you back to a social work question now. In the context of working with complex trauma or trauma at various levels, because you mentioned there was a few different types of trauma, I can imagine, and as a therapist myself, we hear a lot of big, heavy stories as well. We're talking about suicide, for example. These are heavy things. Like, what's some stuff that you do as a social worker and maybe some of your colleagues do to kind of look after yourselves during these heavy conversations and in the valuable work that you're doing supporting veterans?
Again, it's individual. Different people are different. Some people go to the gym a lot and eat vitamin B. So everyone's got different approaches. I suppose for me over the years, because I've dealt across my career with some pretty critical situations in child and family welfare as well, including losing clients, is just trying to provide that balance of being empathetic and connecting with people without owning all their issues. Also providing a bit of a separation between work and home, so that you can regenerate a bit, and being able to debrief with colleagues. Quite often here, we'll just go in each other's rooms and just have a bit of a chat. That's handy. We get good supervision too, which is really good. Internally, we all have an external supervisor that we can talk about issues with, whether it's a particular case or an ethical issue or something like that. So I think it's a range of responses. It's a good idea to keep yourself reasonably healthy and try to get good sleep hygiene, that sort of thing, and take our own advice, do some mindful things that we all like, because I quite often find myself not taking my own advice.
Absolutely. I can hear you there. I'm always preaching about those self-care activities, mindfulness, and often when I start to struggle, I look inwards and I go, am I listening to my own advice here? Am I doing the things that I tell other people to do in therapy? And I'm often not. So then I'm quick to fix up my sleep. Am I drinking too much at the moment? Am I eating the wrong foods? Am I going to the gym, doing exercise? All those wonderful things. And supervision is crucial, I think. Having that external person, you've got internal and external support. So having an external supervisor who can give you an unbiased look at things as well, it's critical. I love my supervision sessions. I go there and I offload a month's worth of mayhem in my mind as well, and I can get to some social work thinking and business stuff as well. I'm choosy with who my supervisor is in terms of a business perspective as well. So it's great that you've got that support as well.
Yeah, I think it's good to be working in an environment that you enjoy too. Like, I really love this work. I like the clients. It's, you feel as if you're doing something useful. It's a supportive work environment, and the bosses are, generally speaking, they're counsellors as well, and so they understand the business. And it's all reflected, I think, that it's quite a satisfying environment to work in. I find that really good.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess you wouldn't be there for so long, for 10 years in the same organisation. So that's a hat off to you for sticking it out for that long. Most of us would move on after a few years when it is such a heavy thing to talk about. But also, if you're passionate about the subject and the people and the industry, that certainly goes a long way too, to looking after yourself too.
Yeah, it does. No, it's interesting work.
Yeah, Ken, I've really enjoyed our conversation around both, your social work background, but also the work of Open Arms and what you do there. It's really insightful. If someone's listening and they want to get in touch with Open Arms, how do they best find them?
You can go on the World Wide Web, Open Arms, or ring 1-800-011-046. That's the 24/7 number. And all they've got to do is identify that they're eligible in one of the ways that I said before. There's no big hoops to go through. We believe what people say. And then they would be referred to a counsellor in one of the locations. So it's a reasonably easy process to go through, just a short intake.
Yeah. And does a serving member or the veteran have to call, or can that be the partner or the child?
It can be anyone. With children, depends a bit on the age, need consent of parents if they're young, but if kids are up around the 16 and up, they can consent to their own treatment, so they can ring independently. We'd obviously, if they're living at home, encourage them to be letting their parents know that they're doing this, but yeah, they're able to consent to their own counselling. So anyone can ring. With couples, they've both got to ring different times, do a separate intake, and there's no barriers there apart from if there's significant domestic violence, then it may not be appropriate to do couples counselling at a particular time. So people may engage in individual counselling first. There's different combinations and permutations there.
Yeah, sure.
But we try to help everyone that rings.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'll put the phone number, and you've given me a nice list of different websites as well. So I'll put them in the show notes as well, so that people can easily access that information. But Ken, I have really enjoyed this. And the last question I ask every single one of my guests is to plug something that makes them feel good. And the reason I ask this question is to kind of leave the show on a bit of a happier note. We do talk about some heavy stuff on the Mindful Men podcast. So what's lighting your candle at the moment? Is it something you're watching on telly? Is it something you're listening to, something you're reading, something you're doing for self-care? What's giving you a bit of joy at the moment?
Well, I've been in Maroochydore for almost 12 months now. I used to be down the Gold Coast, and my wife's working up here as well. So I transferred up, which was good. We're enjoying reacquainting ourselves with Sunshine Coast. We like live music, and we like films and so forth. Went to the local short film awards the other night. That was fun. So we just like the markets. Yeah, we've got kids and grandkids, and so we've got plenty to keep us busy. We're up and down to the Gold Coast a bit too. But yeah, we're enjoying being here and just doing things that the place has to offer. It's a good place to live, and making some new friends and keeping ourselves busy.
Wonderful. Love it. That sense of community as well. It's really hard when we move around a bit. I've moved around a lot in my life too. And I guess a lot of the veterans and their families have moved around as well. So just being out and experiencing whatever locality you are has to offer is a great thing to look after yourself.
Yeah, I agree.
Wonderful. Well, Ken, thanks so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it. And thanks so much for sharing about your journey with, the social work, the Open Arms as well. And yeah, all the best for the future.
Thanks, Simon. Might catch up for a coffee one day, eh? Seeing you're not that far away.
Can't wait. Let's do it. Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, and I hope you got some value from it. If anything triggered your mental health today, please reach out to your support networks. Also, if you loved what you heard, be sure to subscribe to the show and share it with your mates. For more from Mindful Men, you can check us out on Instagram and YouTube, and I'll throw the links to these pages in the show notes below. But until next time, stay mindful.